The Legend of Zelda is not only the name of a legendary saga that has continuously reinvented itself throughout the ages, inspiring thousands of video games that followed its example, but also the title of the first episode in the series, an enigmatic installment that emerged from a unique development process with the aim of creating an anti-Mario. This development was notably lengthy for its time, initially intended for the launch of a mysterious expansion that would never leave Japan. The result was one of the most innovative games in history, a game that left an indelible mark on the industry, even though Shigeru Miyamoto himself didn't have much faith in its success at the time of its release. This is the story of the birth of one of the most renowned franchises in the world of video games, a remarkable tale for an exceptional game, so unique that it would be years before anyone could catch up to its remarkable structure. It's 1984, and the Famicom, the Japanese equivalent of the NES, is making its mark in Japan with convincing sales. Nintendo is beginning to open up to third-party publishers, such as Hudson, who just released Lode Runner, and Namco, who just released Pac-Man, both of which are big successes. Meanwhile, Nintendo is continually pushing the technical boundaries with games like Devil World, featuring relatively large sprites and vertical scrolling, Excitebike, with super smooth horizontal scrolling, and the adaptation of Kung Fu Master with even larger sprites and bosses within the levels. However, Nintendo is in the process of transitioning from cartridges, as they are preparing the Famicom Disk System, a peripheral to connect to the Famicom, replacing cartridges with floppy disks that can hold more data, be rewritten, and thus save game progress. Additionally, it adds an audio track compatible with synthesizers of the time. In Nintendo's eyes, floppy disks are set to replace cartridges, which seem to be reaching their limits. But releasing a peripheral for a console is no easy task, and Miyamoto is aware of that. They need to convey the advantages of floppy disks over cartridges to the general public, and to do that, they need a game that showcases the qualities and makes the benefits of this new peripheral evident to everyone. So he begins to contemplate and jot down ideas for Nintendo's first game to be released on a floppy disk, aiming to leverage the advantages of this new format. For example, he thinks it would be incredibly interesting to create a game that allows players to design dungeons and have their friends play them. But on the other hand, he feels a sense of waste. Nintendo has made so much technical progress, they can display larger sprites, smooth vertical and horizontal scrolling, more colors, better memory management, and so on. Therefore, before transitioning to floppy disks, with the approval of Hiroshi Yamauchi, Nintendo's CEO, he decides to kick off the development of one last game on cartridges, showcasing all these technologies, an athletic game, the term Nintendo used for platform games at the time. And that's how the development of a game that would become Super Mario Bros. Begins, with a remarkable development story that I will detail in an upcoming video. He decides to set aside the game initially planned for the Famicom Disk System launch and focuses on Super Mario Bros. Because it needs to be released sooner, given that it's on a cartridge. However, during the development of Super Mario Bros., the development team thinks of numerous ideas that are set aside because they don't align with the game's vision, but are found interesting by Miyamoto in their own right. In parallel with the development of Super Mario Bros., Miyamoto resumes work on the game planned for the Famicom Disk System launch with a few developers, creating a rather lightweight prototype. While the initial goal of the game was dungeon creation, they quickly realized that it's much more enjoyable to explore dungeons than to create them. As the development of Super Mario Bros. Progresses, they incorporate more and more of the ideas set aside for the other game, and its concept becomes increasingly clear. It's meant to be the complete opposite of Super Mario Bros. While in Super Mario Bros. The stages are linear, and the player doesn't have to wonder where to go, Miyamoto wants this other game to drop the player into a world they must explore. He wants to convey the feeling he had when he was younger, spending hours and hours exploring the area around his home. He recalls, "When I was younger, we didn't have many toys to play with, so I would explore everything around me, and there were plenty of caves and mountains. I would make slingshots and puppets with sticks and twigs to entertain myself. During one of my outings in the mountains, I stumbled upon a lake. It was a big surprise for me to find a lake there. When I traveled across the country without a map, trying to find my way and discovering incredible things along the way, I understood what a true adventure was and the joy of exploration. That's what I wanted to convey. I really wanted to create a game that captures the same feeling as when you arrive in a new town for the first time. I thought it would be great if I could make the player identify with the main character and become completely lost and immersed in a new world. As a symbol, Miyamoto gave it the codename Adventure. The development is complicated because Super Mario Bros. Is the top priority, and most notably, unlike Super Mario Bros., which is based on Mario Bros., the arcade game released in 1983 before evolving into its own game, Nintendo has never ventured into the adventure genre. Furthermore, at that time, there are very few games, even beyond Nintendo, that offer what Miyamoto has in mind. There are a few games like the Ultima series, which were somewhat popular on microcomputers, but Nintendo didn't want to use them as a basis because everything was done through text. For example, to push an object, you had to select the push option from the menu, which they found unsuitable because it didn't give the player the feeling of actually pushing a stone. There's also Black Onyx, which had just been released, where players explore caves, but it's quite archaic. Namco's Tower of Draga was also quite popular at the time, a game where the player wanders through underground labyrinths. However, according to the development team, these games didn't provide that immense sense of freedom and exploration of discovering new places. So Miyamoto spends a lot of time pondering the game and what he could do with it, drawing inspiration from series like Indiana Jones. Miyamoto had some doubts because he wondered if what he had in mind was technically feasible on the Famicom. It was 1985, and even arcade games were struggling to create true adventure games with different locations to explore. The more he thought about it, the more the challenge seemed daunting to him. He explains, "I had been thinking for a while about making a real-time game with very little available memory. It was a huge challenge to create enough content to satisfy players, and I absolutely wanted to avoid doing things halfway and having overly primitive gameplay." Takashi Tezuka, who was on the Super Mario Bros. And Zelda teams, also recalls these discussions. "We decided from the beginning that we wanted to make a real-time adventure game. Nobody wants to perform actions like pushing or pulling objects by selecting options from a menu. If we have to push something, we want to feel the force it takes to do it." All of this seemed too ambitious for its time, but Miyamoto saw a brilliant developer named Toshihiko Nakago, who, with the help of Kazuaki Morita, managed to achieve a monumental amount of content in Super Mario Bros. Through multiple remarkable feats, featuring 32 different levels, diverse backgrounds, and even various gameplay elements. He began to think that perhaps this was not as impossible as it seemed, especially with the extra memory provided by floppy disks. Miyamoto then started drafting a specification, illustrating an example of a dungeon with many floors, objects, and enemies. It's quite remarkable that he had so many ideas so early in the project, including various enemy types, bosses, and different objects for players to use. This laid a strong foundation for the project. Rather quickly, the project's concept evolved from being about creating dungeons and traversing them to a game where players explore an open world with dungeons and hidden secrets, challenging players to think and discover them. Simultaneously, a story begins to take shape, featuring two worlds within the game, one in the past and one in the future. The hero must travel between these worlds to retrieve a trio of electronic chips called the Triforce. As the hero needs to bridge the gap between the past and the future worlds, he is named Link. Although he was initially depicted as right-handed, his design was changed to be left-handed to facilitate his implementation in the game's pixel art. Likely due to memory constraints, the idea of a separate futuristic world was abandoned in favor of a single unified world, with dungeons interconnected in an open world. For the first time, Miyamoto and Tezuka recognized the need for some minimal storytelling and staging to motivate players to explore and to drive them to recover these Triforce fragments. The Triforce itself draws inspiration from the symbol of the Hojo clan, which is found throughout the ancient Japanese capital of Kamakura, symbolizing a lost kingdom of sorts. However, because they needed the story to have some impact, or at least provide a narrative context for immersion, Takashi Tezuka laid the foundation for the storyline and the context. They then sought the assistance of Keiji Terui, a screenwriter who had worked on the Dragon Ball anime series, having previously contributed to Dr. Slump in the films of both anime. Terui crafted a story based on medieval conflicts in Europe, but with considerable creative freedom. In the Kingdom of Hyrule, a name chosen by the development team because it sounded good, an army led by Ganon, the Prince of Darkness, attacks the peaceful realm of Hyrule in a bid to seize the Triforce of Power, a mysterious golden triangle with unique powers. Zelda, Princess of Hyrule, divides the remaining Triforce, the Triforce of Wisdom, into 8 fragments and hides them in dungeons to prevent Ganon from obtaining it. She sends her servant, Impa, to find someone brave enough to retrieve this Triforce. In a fit of rage, Ganon imprisons Princess Zelda and dispatches his troops to locate Impa. Just as Impa is about to be captured, a hero emerges, and that hero is Link, representing the player. But as you can imagine, on the NES during that time, with such limited memory available, the story couldn't be told without the game itself. There were no cinematics, and in any case, having dialogues that conveyed the story would break the game's immersion and rhythm. The developers wanted to drop the player into an unknown world and let them figure things out. So the story was included in the game manual, which wasn't common at the time, although it would become more common later on. In fact, on the game's demo, you could see the message that instructed you to refer to the manual for the story before starting, since this wasn't common. Another advantage of putting the story in the manual was related to the Famicom Disk System. Nintendo released Famicom Disk Writer kiosks, machines where you could replace the game on your diskette with another one for a few dollars. Therefore, having the manual also served as proof of purchase, which remained even after the data on the diskette was replaced with another. In September 1985, Super Mario Bros. Was finally released in Japan after several months of delay, and now the development of the game adventure takes priority and progresses much faster. Miyamoto and Tezuka tackled the most challenging part by sitting side by side and drawing the entire game map on a huge sheet, at least its prototype. This significantly boosts the project, giving it a new look. However, the development team once again encounters the major issues of that era, primarily related to memory limitations. They had many ideas they couldn't incorporate into the game. As Miyamoto explains, "At the time there were many things we wanted to do but couldn't due to technical limitations. For example, for the entrance of the 7th dungeon, we only changed the color of the floor, but we wanted the water to gradually disappear. In the game you can burn small trees, but we wanted to make it possible to burn all the trees. There were many ideas like that which we couldn't implement." The development is highly complex due to technical limitations, but also because, unlike Super Mario Bros., they don't have the luxury of delaying the project. The game must be released in tandem with the Famicom Disk System, and time is of the essence, with the release date fast approaching. After designing the game world, they turn their attention to the dungeons. The development team decides to incorporate puzzles to solve in order to progress, as well as numerous hidden passages, making these sections more intense and suspenseful than the outside world. This variety in gameplay adds to the overall experience of the game. Originally, the game was meant to showcase the capabilities of the Famicom Disk System, but since they removed the dungeon creation feature, it may appear less so on the surface. However, in reality, this game introduced a feature that didn't exist on consoles at that time: the ability to save your progress. This was quite remarkable in an era where games were either short and challenging, sending players back to the beginning, or lacked the technology for saving progress. The game was so ambitious in terms of content that saving progress felt natural. Additionally, thanks to the floppy disks, the game allowed players to enter their name into the game, enabling them to truly embody the hero. Here, the hero wasn't Mario, whom you controlled, but the actual person playing the game. This added significantly to immersion and allowed for multiple different save files. Another significant advantage of the Famicom Disk System was the ability to have higher quality sound. However, Koji Kondo initially faced challenges due to the game's extensive content, leaving very little memory available for music. This constraint resulted in shorter tracks compared to games like Super Mario Bros., with fewer different pieces of music. Furthermore, Miyamoto had specific requests regarding the sound and sound effects. He wanted the music to evoke both the epic feeling of an incredible quest and a slightly mysterious, unsettling atmosphere. Koji Kondo recalls, "Miyamoto wanted the music to have a particular sound. For example, when we used the flute, he had me compose many different sounds. He was very particular about this sound, and he said, 'I don't want it to be just a pleasant sound. I want it to evoke something mysterious.'" However, the requests were quite vague. In the project specifications, for example, the music for the caves was simply described as a short background music. Koji Kondo had to compose something based on this brief description, all while dealing with technical constraints such as the console's primitive sound capabilities and limited memory. But after much effort, he eventually created something that greatly pleased the rest of the team. This was the first time Koji Kondo had to completely change his approach to composing. Previously, he composed music to match the game's tempo, such as the music in Mario, with its famous Latin rhythms for outdoor levels or the waltz for underwater stages. However, in this case, instead of following the game's action, the music needed to complement the environments and characterize the locations. Another significant challenge during the game's development was programming the enemies. There were various types of enemies, but creating their patterns was a delicate task at that time. This included determining their movements, reactions when the player approached, and how they could be defeated using the available items. Miyamoto placed great emphasis on this aspect. As he explains, "I love the Darknut Soldier, both for its name and for the way it is programmed. It faces Link with its shield, and when it sees Link, it can change its speed. At that time, this was a very sophisticated behavior." This level of attention was applied to each enemy, and they even went so far as to create an enemy with large ears that could be defeated very easily by shouting into your controller. Yes, because the Famicom's second controller included a microphone, which the development team decided to use quite creatively. To save as much memory as possible, the dungeons were initially drawn on graph paper, where each square represented a dungeon room. They were then assembled like a puzzle, minimizing the need to save individual dungeon data and reducing the amount of memory used. Tezuka drew everything in this manner and handed it over to Nakago, who entered the data into the diskette. Nakago noticed that about half of the dungeon data was empty. Upon re-examining the graph paper, he realized that Tezuka had only used half of the available data, leaving a significant portion of memory unused. While this may seem like a simple mistake, designing dungeons in this way was a considerable challenge, so it's not surprising that such an error occurred. However, in the meantime, Miyamoto had played the game and found it to be excellent as it was. He was concerned that making the dungeons larger or making deep changes could disrupt the game's balance. Instead, he proposed the idea of creating a second quest within the game, a bonus quest to be unlocked after completing the first one. This involved designing a new quest with different dungeons and changing their locations, making it a more challenging quest that added to the game's overall content. Drawing the dungeons as a giant puzzle with different rooms was a clever idea to save memory, and it wasn't the only one. Japanese has 4 alphabets, or writing systems, or something close to it. There are hiragana, which are very useful for writing words of Japanese origin. Then there are katakana, which represent the same sounds, but are used for foreign words. Kanji are symbols that often represent whole words, and many of them originate from Chinese literature. Finally, there's Romaji, the Latin alphabet. In an effort to maximize available memory while keeping the game accessible, they wrote the game's text in katakana, even though it's typically used for writing foreign words. This choice is visible in other Japanese games with similar limitations. As surprising as it may seem, one of the aspects of the game that Shigeru Miyamoto struggled with the most was its title. As he recounts, "Of course, the game's title wasn't decided right from the beginning. I knew I wanted it to be The Legend of Something, but I had a hard time figuring out what that something would be. It was at that point a colleague said to me, 'Why don't you make a picture book for this game?' He suggested an illustrated story where Link would save a very beautiful princess and mentioned, 'There's a famous American author whose wife is named Zelda. How about giving that name to the princess?' I didn't really understand the idea of the picture book, but I liked the name Zelda a lot, so I took the liberty of giving it to the princess." Since the princess is at the center of the story, being attacked and triggering the beginning of the legend with the Triforce fragments and the hero who must retrieve them, Miyamoto chose the title Zeruda no Densetsu, which means The Legend of Zelda, with the subtitle The Hyrule Fantasy. We arrive in February 1986, and The Legend of Zelda is nearly completed. The entire team is proud of the game, but at the very last moment, just as the game was about to go into production, the next day, the developers were alerted to a major issue. During the game's development, before having a clear idea of how the project would evolve, The title screen music was Ravel's Bolero, and it ended up fitting so well with what was happening and the pace of the title screen presentation that Koji Kondo left it in the game. However, in Japan, an artist's copyright expires 50 years after their death, and in Ravel's case, it had been just under 50 years since he passed away, so they didn't have the rights to use his music. But the game was supposed to go into production the next morning, so Koji Kondo had a few hours to recompose an entirely new piece of music, and one of the most important in the game. He spent the whole night at the office reworking melodies from other pieces of the game's music and composing it to match the exact tempo of the title screen. In the end, he found it even better than Ravel's Bolero. The game is finally completed, ready for production, and the release is just around the corner. The development team is incredibly proud of what they've achieved, but at the same time, they are very nervous and don't have a lot of faith in the project. When they finished developing Super Mario Bros., Miyamoto and Tezuka had looked at each other and said, "We've got something great here," and they knew that Super Mario Bros. Had a bright future ahead. But with The Legend of Zelda, it's that complete opposite. Miyamoto and his team are very anxious and worried because they fear that the players won't understand what to do in the game and won't be as interested in it. The way the game was constructed requires players to get involved, and since it's something entirely innovative and rarely seen before, they're afraid players will be lost in the wrong way and, as a result, abandon the game, even though it required an enormous amount of work. These concerns are legitimate, especially because Super Mario Bros. Is skyrocketing in popularity in Japan, starting to take off in the United States, and everyone loves the game precisely because it's incredibly easy to pick up, moving from left to right with a straightforward understanding of everything. This is the complete opposite of The Legend of Zelda's vision. On February 21, 1986, Nintendo released the Famicom Disk System with a disc version of Super Mario Bros., as well as games like tennis, baseball, golf, soccer, mahjong, and most importantly, The Legend of Zelda, which had taken over a year to develop, an unusually long time for that era. To everyone's surprise, the journalists of the time were astonished by the game, describing it as exceptional. It received a perfect 5 out of 5 rating from Famitsu, which also included it in its list of the best games of the year and even as the game with the most significant musical work of the year. The game quickly gained a stellar reputation, and sales were excellent for a launch title for a new hardware accessory. American magazines reported sales of up to 1 million copies on the first day. Although this figure may sound a bit exaggerated, it still indicates a remarkable start. The engine development team was surprised by the success, and now players eagerly engaged with the game, loving the enormous sense of freedom and exploration. Nintendo had just invented an entirely new genre of games, later known as action RPGs. In Japan, even though its popularity was remarkable, The Legend of Zelda didn't quite reach blockbuster status. It managed to sell over 1 million copies, which was rare for games at the time. However, 2 factors held it back from becoming a true phenomenon in Japan. Firstly, only a few months after its release, Enix launched Dragon Quest, which incorporated some similar elements to Zelda. Dragon Quest quickly became a massive hit in Japan due to its advantageous release timing just before the holidays, availability on popular microcomputers, and a less complex gameplay system. Secondly, the Famicom Disk System, on which The Legend of Zelda was released, saw disappointing sales. Only a small portion of Famicom owners purchased the expansion, limiting the potential audience for the game. Despite these challenges, achieving sales of over 1 million units in these conditions was incredible. More importantly, The Legend of Zelda gained a phenomenal reputation and was recognized as a unique gaming experience. In the United States, the NES had been on the market for a year, and it was slowly gaining traction, partly thanks to the success of Super Mario Bros. However, the early years weren't easy because the American video game market was still recovering from the 1983 video game crash, and many people were wary of video games. Nevertheless, the NES was gradually changing the landscape. Simultaneously, the Famicom Disk System faced a few challenges. There were issues with piracy on the discs, although it wasn't widespread. The diskettes themselves had some durability problems. Furthermore, cartridge technology rapidly advanced after the Famicom Disk System's release. It became possible to store as much or even more data on cartridges than on diskettes, thanks to new technology called the multi-memory controller. These special chips allowed for greater data capacity, improved sprite management, natural scrolling, and even the ability to save data on the cartridge using a built-in battery to maintain part of the memory even when the console was turned off. The Legend of Zelda was thus ported to an international cartridge and translated in the process, thanks to the greater available memory. Some parts of the game, like the soundtrack, were modified since cartridges couldn't use the Famicom Disk System's additional features. However, Nintendo of America had great faith in the game's potential, especially after its strong sales in Japan. Albeit slowed down by the Famicom Disk System, they decided to go all out. The Legend of Zelda was manufactured on gold cartridges to distinguish it from other games. It was one of the very first cartridges in the world to incorporate a save system. The packaging was also revamped. In contrast to the Japanese version, which featured Link on the cover with Hyrule in the background, the American version had a very understated box. It featured the name The Legend of Zelda, without the subtitle The Hyrule Fantasy. The box had a crest with a heart, a key, a monster, and a hole that cleverly revealed the gold cartridge inside, giving the impression of a treasure hunt. This design was exceptionally clever, especially considering that at that time there was no internet, very few gaming magazines, and most people purchased games based on what they saw in advertisements or solely relying on the game's cover art. The cover art for Zelda was both beautiful and very intriguing. But Nintendo of America was concerned that the game might be too difficult, and particularly too frustrating for the American audience, which was considered less patient and entirely unaccustomed to this type of game. They made the decision to include game cards with hints and some assistance inside the game box. Miyamoto wasn't particularly thrilled about this, as the essence of the game was to be lost in the world and feel completely immersed without a map. Moreover, it was about experiencing strong emotions like surprise when you discovered something. With a map providing hints, a significant part of the game's appeal was diminished. After these reservations, Nintendo of America decided to seal the cards and print a message instructing players to only use them as a last resort. In the middle of 1987, The Legend of Zelda arrived in North America, becoming the very first RPG for the NES in this region. Nintendo of America, which didn't have much money at that time, decided to support the game's launch with a promotional campaign focused exclusively on this game, which was a rare approach for them. They typically preferred advertisements that showcased multiple different games. The first advertisement was quite standard, but the second, which notably highlighted the game's enemies, surprisingly enjoyed great success, and it contributed to making the game well known. And thanks to all this, the game is a massive success in the United States. It is already an exceptional critical success, with the few magazines that reviewed it praising the game highly. Computer Gaming World named it the best adventure game of 1988, and Computer Entertainment Magazine stated that the game offers an incredibly rich gaming experience that goes far beyond other games. They noted its beautiful graphics, superb original music, and excellent animations. They further mentioned that the game would appeal to everyone, regardless of age or gender, with a magical aura surrounding it that makes it essential. Sales quickly followed suit, as after just 1 year on the American market, it had sold over 2 million units, making it one of the best-selling games on the console. This was despite the fact that the game was priced higher than others due to the technologies it incorporated. In addition to all of this, Nintendo of America implemented a special promotion. Anyone who bought the game could become a member of the Fun Club, a small newsletter that provided game tips. Zelda began to have an increasingly prominent place in this newsletter, and thanks to the game tips, the number of members exploded. Minoru Arakawa, CEO of Nintendo of America, decided to start the Nintendo Power magazine, the official Nintendo magazine, which became a huge trend as later on every console would have its own official magazine. Since the game was already translated into English, it was quickly brought to Europe, where it was released a few weeks after the American launch. Once again, it received astonishing critical acclaim. The French magazine Tilt awarded it an excellent score of 16 out of 20, which was quite rare for them since they rarely gave scores above 15. They emphasized the high-quality graphics, flawless animations, and the most astonishing aspect of the game, its sound. They described it as a game of incredible richness, a masterpiece of the genre, and noted that creating such a monument must have required a considerable amount of work. The magazine ranked it as the best adventure game of its time across all platforms, after comparing it to other top games of the genre. They also highlighted its incredible global success and stated that it was one of the greatest hits of all time, with a special mention for the soundtrack. Player One would later conduct a retro review and similarly elevated it to the ranks of a video game classic, giving it an impressive 98%. The trend was similar in other European countries. In Germany, the magazine Video Games also awarded it an excellent score. British magazines like Ace and Computer and Video Games expressed the same amazement at the game's vast content and gave it high ratings. This happened even 3 years after the game was created. The Legend of Zelda became one of the best-selling NES games in Europe, despite being in English and only a small part of Europe being English-speaking. Moreover, its cartridge was more expensive than others. It's incredible how The Legend of Zelda managed to appeal to such a wide audience, including groups that were initially considered quite different. Wherever it went, the same observation held true. Astonished journalists charmed by an innovative gaming experience, and the general public quickly won over by a game that seemed quite distinct from what was popular at the time. It wasn't just that the journalists appreciated the game, they were primarily shocked by the game and all that it had to offer. Computer and Video Games described it as more comprehensive than some arcade games, even though it was just an NES game that was already a few years old. This illustrates how far ahead of its time The Legend of Zelda was. But how did such a distinct game manage to captivate such a universal audience? How did a game that demanded so much player involvement manage to appeal to so many? To the extent that Nintendo reissued it on a cartridge in 1994, 8 years after its initial release. They even admitted drawing inspiration from this game during the development of Breath of the Wild. Why does it consistently appear on lists of the greatest games of all time, despite having numerous technical limitations? Why do retro reviews, decades after its release, still award it such exceptional scores, when one might assume that an NES game from that era would have aged poorly? What makes it so exceptional? Well, let's explore this legendary game with a thorough analysis. The game begins with a beautiful title screen, featuring the game's name and a waterfall amidst rocks. It does something quite surprising for its time in the form of an attract mode. An attract mode is a demo of the game that plays when you don't interact with the title screen. Historically, this was essential for arcade games because it helped promote the game and entice players to try it out in arcades. This tradition later carried over to consoles. For instance, let's look at the attract mode for Super Mario Bros. It directly shows the player the game, how to play it, and so on. However, The Legend of Zelda's attract mode is a bit different. It starts with some text, presenting the game's prologue, and then emphasizes the richness of the game's items, directing the player to consult the manual. What's surprising is that despite the game's graphical qualities, as noted by journalists of the time, you might naively think that Nintendo would highlight the game's graphics, but there are no in-game images shown before you start playing. This is a strong choice that already showcases Nintendo's ingenuity. They chose to emphasize the mysterious aspect of the game by not revealing anything at all, even if it meant not showcasing certain qualities of the game. This is further accentuated by the game's beautiful music, which also has a mysterious quality. It's remarkable that this music was composed in just a few hours shortly before the game's release. The attract mode concludes by directing the player to consult the manual for more details about the game. Now, the Japanese manual is much shorter than the international manual. It provides an overview of the game's story in detail, descriptions of various items, different enemies, and even specific instructions on how to find the first 2 dungeons. In my opinion, the Japanese manual strikes the right balance, offering slight gameplay tips and introductions without giving away too much. However, in some countries like France, the manual is somewhat unclear because it's shared with the Netherlands, with the Dutch language included. This is unfortunate because European countries needed the manual more due to the game not being translated and the in-game text being in English. We start the game by giving our character a name. In The Legend of Zelda, we don't play as Mario or a character that seems to exist within the game's world. Instead, we embody our own character. This is the first step in fostering immersion, which we'll discuss shortly. As we begin the game, we are immediately thrust into the world without much guidance, or so it seems. One surprising aspect of this game for its time is the absence of a score. While this might seem trivial today, scoring was incredibly important back then, as it allowed players to compare their performance, and for many games, the objective wasn't necessarily to complete the game, but to achieve the highest score. However, The Legend of Zelda dispenses with a score because it is built around a narrative, and the goal is to save Zelda, not achieve the highest score. Zelda is one of the first adventure games on the NES and among the very first action RPGs or RPGs on a console. So for the vast majority of players, this would be their very first adventure, and they need to be educated. Much like the first level of Super Mario Bros., the beginning of Zelda instructs the player seamlessly. You start with nothing but a shield and no sword. However, conveniently, on the very first screen, you encounter a cave with an old man who gives you a sword. Why doesn't the game give the player a sword right from the start? The game's intent is to teach the player from the beginning that they will need to explore, and they will be rewarded for doing so. Nothing is handed to them. It's a clever way to commence the player's journey. If by any chance they wander off without seeking the sword, they'll quickly meet their demise. When you die, you're brought back to this point, so they'll eventually obtain the sword. What's incredible about Zelda is that it manages to guide the player while simultaneously allowing them complete freedom and making them feel lost. Right next to the starting point, you'll find a cave with items available for purchase, but they come at a high price. To gather rupees, the in-game currency, you need to defeat enemies. This means that right from the beginning of the game, it encourages the player to engage with the monsters on their path, giving them a reason and motivation to do so. What's clever here is that it provides the player with a reason to defeat enemies, but the early game enemies are designed to teach the player movement and combat. These enemies don't attack but move around erratically, allowing the player to become accustomed to movement. Some of them send projectiles from a distance, illustrating that our shield can protect us from these attacks when we stop attacking. Additionally, the player quickly realizes that, with full health, their sword can also shoot projectiles, enabling them to attack from a distance. And from the very beginning, you're seemingly lost in The Legend of Zelda, primarily because the first Zelda game is a true open world. Right from the first second of the game, you can go almost anywhere. But how does the game manage to guide the player while being open-ended? In contrast to a game like Super Mario Bros., where the player is required to move from left to right, making it easy to predict their actions, in The Legend of Zelda, the player can go wherever they want. So how does it guide the player? Well, this is where the role of enemies comes into play. If you venture too far from the initial area, either to the left or right, for example, you'll quickly encounter extremely powerful enemies that can defeat you in a single blow. Since death merely sends you back to the game's starting area, and considering that you retain your rupees and items, the game encourages you to keep exploring until you find what you're looking for. To prevent the player from getting lost between enemies they can or cannot defeat, the game has the brilliant idea of having red enemies and blue enemies, with the blue enemies being much stronger. This gives the player a reference point to know when they've gone too far, and they can easily backtrack because the enemies take a bit of time to appear and show up far from the player, allowing them to analyze and make a decision. Additionally, the game cleverly introduces one or two blue enemies in the midst of red ones first, and then, a bit farther along, presents screens with only blue enemies, which helps the player evaluate the difficulty of each screen. In summary, the game encourages exploration throughout, never punishing the player and continuously rewarding them. This approach extends throughout the game, promoting exploration without entirely giving everything away, thus giving the player the sense of being lost and having to discover a whole new world. In reality, the game provides everything the player needs to navigate and guides them without them even realizing it. One of the most significant symbols of this approach is the radar in the upper left corner. While exploring, it provides a rough idea of which part of the world the player is in. However, it's only a radar, not a full map, so while it gives the player some hints about their location, it still leaves them feeling somewhat lost because they don't know exactly where they are. This is an exceptionally clever design choice. But how do you navigate without a map? Firstly, the game's areas are separated quite distinctly, allowing the player to understand their location. Furthermore, enemies play a crucial role in this. Enemies appear on every screen in the game, and when you defeat them, they don't reappear unless you die. So if you defeat the enemies along your path, you can tell whether you've been there before or not. This is in stark contrast to other games like Metroid, released around the same time, where enemies respawn endlessly, creating a sense of oppression. In Zelda, the ability to get rid of enemies reinforces the profound feeling of freedom and empowerment, making you even more eager to explore. But one might wonder if there are enemies everywhere, and when you die, you go back to the beginning. Do you not get stuck constantly battling and returning to the start? Well, not really, for a few reasons. Firstly, enemies in the initial zones are not very strong. Secondly, you'll find fairy fountains conveniently placed all over the game, which restore your health. Since you can use them infinitely and defeated enemies don't reappear when you backtrack, if you're having trouble on a particular screen, you can simply backtrack a bit, heal at the fairy fountains, and then resume exploring. However, since these fountains aren't very abundant, the player always feels vulnerable and in danger, striking a very intelligent and well-balanced gameplay design. Another major factor encouraging exploration is the astonishing diversity of environments. You have mountain climbing, a hidden secret behind a waterfall, a repeating forest, an actual cemetery with tombstones, a river that flows into the sea. While this may seem quite standard by today's standards, for a 1986 NES game with such a vast world, it's remarkably impressive. What's more, the game's map may seem deceptively small, but it's transformed into a giant labyrinth, making the journey longer than it initially appears, and ensuring it's denser and more unpredictable. This aspect works effectively, as you never know what you'll encounter next, greatly fueling the player's curiosity and desire to explore further to discover what's beyond the next screen. Of course, what makes you want to explore the most is the fact that you find secrets everywhere, all the time. Simply put, there are no dead ends, no screens that serve no purpose, and no moments where the player is wasting time. This means that the player can be rewarded constantly, provided they deserve it. The game doesn't give anything for free. It's up to the player to uncover the secrets and obtain what they can. For instance, you may come across a cave with a non-playable character who says nothing. The music stops, and in reality, you'll need to bring them an item located at the other end of the map in exchange for potions. But is it cruel to have to retrieve items from the other side of the map just to be rewarded with a merchant? Well, it would be if there weren't NPCs giving us hints. In the game, there are plenty of somewhat cryptic hints scattered around, allowing the player to anticipate such situations. You can even find caves where you can purchase this kind of information, which is incredibly clever. If the player invests a little in the game by exploring and defeating enemies, they'll collect rupees and can purchase this kind of information. This further rewards the player for having explored, even if they haven't found everything entirely on their own. For example, in the world, you'll come across a labyrinth with a repeating screen, but you can buy the information from an old lady if you've explored enough. We also come across merchants with varying prices, meaning that the more you explore, the better you'll know where to buy and make savings. In this game, rupees are highly important as they allow you to purchase essential items to progress. This again encourages exploration to find the best places to shop. There are also what's known as money-making games, little games where you can win or lose money. You even encounter enemies who give you rupees with that famous phrase, "It's a secret to everybody," an enigmatic phrase on which Miyamoto commented, "This phrase has several meanings. It's a secret that you must hide from your friends and family, namely that you can earn rupees. But when an enemy like the Moblin gives you rupees, it means he's betrayed his comrades. That's also a secret he needs to keep hidden." You can also find incredibly powerful items, like upgraded swords that you can only obtain if you have enough hearts. And you can even find items that expand the map further. There's a power bracelet that allows you to access underground shortcuts throughout Hyrule, which is incredibly useful. And you can even discover heart containers that increase your maximum health. You find all these things everywhere and in various ways. You might discover secrets by bombing walls, finding hidden areas behind waterfalls, burning bushes, pushing rocks or graves. or even awakening certain enemies by approaching them, revealing staircases, items, or even passing through walls. This is the aspect of the game that generates the most debate. Some criticize it for being too unpredictable, suggesting that you have to bomb every wall or burn every bush to eventually find secrets. However, I find this criticism unjustified for several reasons. First, many of these secrets are just bonuses and not necessarily to complete the game. Second, there are plenty of hints for finding the mandatory secrets in the game. Moreover, the game's level design strongly encourages this kind of exploration. For instance, when you see a lone tree blocking your path, it naturally makes you want to burn it down. When you encounter a large boulder in your way, you may think about placing a bomb. When you reach a dead end, you might consider bombing it. If you come across a seemingly empty graveyard, you'll likely feel compelled to push the tombstones. There are even moments where you encounter the same landscapes as in other screens, but with missing entrances, promoting you try using a bomb. Some people criticize the game for not having visibly cracked walls that indicate where you should place a bomb to find secrets. However, the lack of these visual clues is precisely what makes the discovery so satisfying. The absence of such hints forces players to rely on their own intuition and observation, making every discovery more meaningful. That's what's so remarkable about games that don't directly guide the player. Everything you achieve is a result of your own actions and decisions. In the first Zelda, you embark on a true adventure where you must rely on your skills and wit, with no hand-holding. Furthermore, what's clever is that enemies often drop bombs, which you can use to uncover secrets. So the more you invest in the game by defeating enemies, the better your chances of finding these secrets. But of course, the main reason that drives exploration is to find those famous dungeons that contain pieces of the Triforce. What's surprising here is that almost all of the dungeons are accessible from the beginning in a somewhat non-linear order. Of course, it's better to tackle them in order, but you're not obligated to do so. It's your adventure, even though some dungeons can't be completed before others due to the need for specific items. What's clever here is to prevent the player from wandering aimlessly. The first 3 dungeons are easy to locate and relatively close to the starting point. As you progress, the later dungeons become more hidden and farther away from the beginning. They require you to reveal them, like the 7th dungeon, which requires using the flute near a lake, or burning a bush to reveal the 8th dungeon. To help players know where they're headed, the dungeons are numbered in the upper left corner. The dungeons vary with different enemies not found in the overworld, creating a more ominous atmosphere. The music is more foreboding with a short loop. Enemies appear immediately, whereas in the overworld, they take some time to appear on the screen, allowing for easier exploration. Inside each dungeon, enemies are more aggressive, and each dungeon is distinguished by its unique color. These dungeons follow the classic dungeon structure seen in later Zelda games, which this one laid the foundation for. In these dungeons, you acquire one or more new items that are highly useful for your adventure, some of which assist you in the overworld or in locating subsequent dungeons. For example, you may obtain the raft. There are secrets to uncover within the dungeons, small puzzles to solve, keys to find that unlock doors, a compass that shows the location of the Triforce piece, and the boss, as well as maps for each dungeon. In contrast to the overworld, which lacks a map and encourages exploration to the fullest, the dungeons guide you through the map and compass, showing you the simplest route to each end. In the early dungeons, the map is easily found along the way, and the initial secrets are simple to uncover. You can easily find keys and secret rooms, making it relatively easy to obtain items like the bow. However, as you progress, the difficulty level increases. In the 4th dungeon, the rooms are not lit, and you must use the candle to illuminate them. The dungeons become progressively more intense, with more restricted movement. You'll even encounter previous dungeon bosses as mini-bosses or regular enemies. There's backtracking to add complexity. For example, in the 4th dungeon, there are winding rooms with holes that slow down exploration, even though you can't fall into them. However, you quickly discover the ladder, which allows you to walk one space across gaps, making it easier to return to previous rooms. Similarly, in the 7th dungeon, you face very strong wizards who cast spells. Right after that, you find the magic wand, which allows you to do the same. It's a clever way to showcase items, although it's not executed flawlessly everywhere. In this particular Zelda, many items are bonuses, like the boomerang, but others are mandatory. However, the game doesn't ensure that you have them before allowing you to progress. For example, in the first dungeon, you can find the bow, but you don't need it to complete the dungeon. This means that if you finish the dungeon without obtaining it, you might find yourself facing Goma, the boss of the 6th dungeon, several hours later. Goma can only be defeated with the bow, which can lead to a confusing situation where you're not sure what to do. What's even more surprising is that this seems to be intentional. For instance, in some dungeons like the 4th dungeon, there is a small river you must cross to complete the dungeon, ensuring that you've obtained the ladder. They knew how to implement these safeguards, but they didn't do it for all necessary items and dungeons by choice. Later in the game, you acquire the flute, which allows you to teleport to previous dungeons, making this kind of backtracking easier. This situation can be quite cruel, and it's probably why it was abandoned in subsequent games. The dungeons evolve to become more complex, and there's an interesting progression in the use of bombs. In the first 4 dungeons, bombs are entirely optional, used for blowing up certain walls to reveal secret passages, usually containing rupees or bonuses. However, in the 5th dungeon, the game provides you with bombs. You find yourself in a blocked room with no apparent way to proceed. Consulting your map, you see a room adjacent to yours, so you place a bomb to open a passage, allowing you to continue. This signifies the game's way of telling the player that up until this point, using bombs to destroy dungeon walls was optional, but now it's becoming mandatory. This significantly enhances the utility of bombs, and the game quickly offers you the opportunity to upgrade your bomb-carrying capacity. In the subsequent dungeons, you'll need more bombs to break through certain walls. There's also something slightly perplexing at the beginning. The keys you find in dungeons can open all locked doors in all dungeons. They aren't specific to a particular dungeon. For instance, a key found in the first dungeon could be used in the last dungeon. This is because if you explore the dungeons thoroughly, you may find more keys than you need. However, if you rush through the dungeons and head straight for the boss, you might run out of keys, leaving you stuck. You can purchase keys from merchants, but it can be a bit tricky to grasp initially, especially since the later dungeons become so challenging that you'll likely want to get to the end as quickly as possible. This highlights the interesting link between the world outside and the dungeons, showing that The Legend of Zelda isn't just about the world outside and the dungeons. Both are strongly interconnected, creating a unique synergy. Although the two are seemingly opposites, with one being an expansive open world that imparts an immense sense of freedom, power, and exploration, and the other, the dungeons, having a more oppressive atmosphere that emphasizes combat, including powerful adversaries and bosses. They both remain deeply connected. On one hand, exploration serves the purpose of discovering the dungeons, while on the other hand, the dungeons also contribute to the exploration. You find items within dungeons that expand your capabilities in the overworld, such as the raft that allows access to the next dungeon, or the ladder that enables crossing rivers or retrieving bonus items like extra hearts. These same hearts can be found after defeating a boss and subsequently allow you to acquire more powerful swords. The flute found in one of the dungeons facilitates faster travel in the overworld, and NPCs encountered in dungeons provide hints that are useful in the overworld or help in locating the next dungeons. After defeating a boss and collecting a Triforce piece, you are healed, enabling you to continue your exploration in prime condition. This synergy between the two facets of the game is vital because it instills a profound sense of progression and perpetuates an unending feeling of adventure. Just because you're in a dungeon doesn't mean you're not advancing in the adventure, and the time taken to locate the next dungeon only serves to strengthen you, making subsequent dungeons easier to tackle. Moreover, you won't even need to ponder those questions thanks to the game's immersion, which is one of its most significant qualities. What significantly enhances immersion, in my opinion, is that the world in which you move seems completely indifferent to your presence. Unlike most games where the world revolves around the player and every character reacts to your presence, this is not the case in The Legend of Zelda. In fact, it doesn't even feel like you're playing a game. At times, enemies won't attack until you get close to them. There are no cracks in the walls to suggest where to place bombs, and there's no companion like Navi or Fi, as seen in later games in the series. When you move objects, you can feel the weight of what you're moving, and you always have the freedom to choose what you want to do. For instance, you can decide to avoid combat if you wish, which was not common in games of that era, where you were often locked into combat with enemies. The game encourages and rewards experimentation and creativity. For example, if you don't have the candle to illuminate rooms, the explosion of a bomb creates a brief flash that helps you see. Enemies are sensitive to various different weapons, and the items you collect have no descriptions or names in the adventure. Therefore, items like the blue ring, the power bracelet, or the Bible require players to figure out their functions for themselves, even if there are certain indicators, like Link's attire changing to signify that you're taking less damage. The game maintains an air of mystery about everything, providing only hints to help you progress without ever explicitly stating things. It offers diverse pieces of information like how to find stronger items, the boss's weakness, or secret entrances. All of this constantly compels the player to be active and question what's happening, which immerses them in the game and strengthens that immersion. In other games, when you obtain an item and it comes with a description of its function, it inevitably breaks the immersion and reminds you that you're playing a game. In The Legend of Zelda, there's nothing to disrupt that immersion, which is incredibly enjoyable. What also enhances immersion is this sense of survival that always pervades. There's never a moment of true tranquility. There are no breaks, no villages as seen in traditional RPGs, where you can replenish your resources and interact with friendly NPCs. In The Legend of Zelda, there's nothing of the sort, no one to befriend, no areas to rest. You're alone, constantly facing danger with every screen, and that danger becomes increasingly pronounced. Additionally, the items you collect are far from reassuring. You don't obtain legendary magical objects that you might find in other RPGs. Instead, you get rather simple items like a ladder or a raft that you must make do with. This adds significantly to the feelings of solitude, survival, and therefore immersion. It's a remarkably intelligent aspect of the game and showcases the developer's mastery. This concept aligns with one of Miyamoto's visions. He wanted players to feel isolated while playing, but exchange information with each other, ask questions, help each other progress, and figure out where to go next, a sort of collaborative gameplay. This is precisely what happened, culminating in the creation of Nintendo Power magazine. However, it's important to remember that this is still a video game, so players need some guidance. For this purpose, they created a quest status screen, where you can track your progress, change your items, and so on. Paradoxically, the separation of the quest status screen from the action screen, a departure from the approach in games like Super Mario, enhances immersion. In the action screen, there's nothing that isn't part of the game. The dungeons, and fosters immersion is the incredible diversity within the game. First and foremost, the game boasts an astonishing variety of enemies, which was exceptional for a game of its time. These diverse enemies force players to confront entirely different situations. There are Tektites that hop around erratically, Octoroks that attack from a distance, Lever that emerge from the ground and can appear beneath you, Peahats that are invulnerable while flying and only become vulnerable when stationary, Armos, transformed stone soldiers that awaken if you approach them and move at various speeds. Then there are Guinness, the ghosts in the graveyard, with the unique feature of being invincible. You have to kill the basic Guinea to eliminate all the others that appear when you approach a tombstone. There are Lynels, extremely powerful creatures that attack from a distance and are challenging to defeat, as well as Zoras that typically remain in the water, often out of reach, and send projectiles before submerging. You can even consider rock slides as enemies that tumble down from the mountains. While it may seem like a lot, these are only the outdoor world's enemies, and there are more than twice as many in the dungeons, and there's an incredible variety. Some enemies split into two smaller ones when defeated, while skeletons attack in hordes. There are hands that return you to the entrance of a dungeon, enemies that throw boomerangs, necessitating anticipation of the boomerang's return, wizards that hurl spells, powerful knights who are difficult to defeat and vary their speed, enemies with large ears that are sensitive to sound and can be eliminated by shouting into the second controller of the Famicom. Some enemies swallow you and melt your shield, and there are even enemies that are impossible to kill until you've incapacitated all the smaller ones surrounding them. In some, there is an extraordinary level of diversity, And on top of that, there are bosses that are all distinct from one another. For instance, the first boss is a dragon that fires 3 fireballs, similar to what you'd find in shoot-'em-up games of the time, like Gradius. But the second boss is a Dodongo, which doesn't offer a fast-paced battle like the first boss, but rather presents a small puzzle on how to defeat it. In fact, you need to place a bomb in front of it for it to swallow. Then there's a 4-headed boss that moves faster as it loses heads, followed by a very challenging 3-headed dragon that you must decapitate by striking it at the neck. Finally, there's Ganon, who is completely invisible and moves very swiftly. Once again, this brings about constantly changing situations, renewing the game experience continually. It's a series of discoveries that add to the fantastic sense of adventure that never lets up throughout the game. The only small drawback is that some bosses are reused, but considering this is a 1986 NES game, it's understandable. And this logic is also present when it comes to items. First, we have a nice mix of classic items like the bow with arrows that cost rupees to use or bombs that serve multiple purposes. But more importantly, we also have highly original items, such as a candle that serves to illuminate rooms or burn trees, bait that can be given to an enemy to let us pass, a boomerang that is found quite early and stuns enemies, and even a ladder that allows us to walk 1 square over gaps. It's fantastic to have these unique items because they often surprise us and leave us intrigued about what we might find next. Some items are optional and can evolve, and most importantly, they serve outside of dungeons, as I mentioned earlier, to enhance exploration and help us progress further. What's particularly rewarding here, unlike traditional RPGs, is that there are no experience bars or character progression. What makes us truly progress are, on the one hand, our equipment, with almost all items being upgradable either through merchants, NPCs, or bonus rooms within dungeons, and on the other hand, we as players also progress, which reflects what our character experiences. As we engage in more battles, we improve as well. And these improvements will be needed because The Legend of Zelda is a challenging game, although the difficulty increases gradually. It's not one of those NES games that become impossible after just a few minutes of play. The real challenge is concentrated in the last 2 or 3 dungeons, where having upgraded swords and the tunic to reduce damage is crucial, which isn't that hard to find, honestly. Additionally, even though the game can be challenging at times, it doesn't feel unfair. There are no moments where you die and feel like there was nothing you could do. In fact, enemies drop plenty of hearts, fairies are available, you can collect potions, and most importantly, the hitboxes for both enemies, the area the game registers as a hit, and your sword are larger than they appear visually, while your character's hitbox is smaller than it appears visually. This design prevents frustration when you get hit. It's solely your fault. All these factors, combined with the changing variety of enemies, the different items you can use in combat, and increasingly difficult battles throughout the game, keep monotony at bay. However, the few shortcomings that could be attributed to the game may be the result of its ambitious nature. First, there are some lags and slowdowns in certain rooms due to the presence of too many enemies, which can disrupt immersion. There are also quite a few rooms in the dungeons with repeated puzzles and the same pushable blocks, as well as repeated boss encounters and even reused sprites in the overworld. However, they've used this design intelligently by hiding secrets within them, as I showed earlier. It's not a significant issue considering that it's relatively minor in the middle of the game. Given the technical limitations of NES games of that era, it's still quite impressive. The other minor issue could be related to the screen scrolling. Since the game is designed screen by screen, as it was almost impossible to do otherwise from a technical perspective, the screen transition takes about 1 second. While this might not seem like much, a faster scrolling would have made the action smoother, although it wasn't technically feasible at the time. This game was at the cutting edge of technology for its era, so these criticisms may be somewhat unfair. Despite its technical limitations, The Legend of Zelda is filled with brilliant staging ideas. For instance, visually, Link and the enemies stand out from the background to make the action as clear as possible, evidenced by the fact that they don't cast a shadow underneath them, unlike trees or stationary objects. This design also helps in indicating when objects become enemies, like the Statue Knights, which is part of the smart ideas that make Nintendo games very clear and user-friendly. There are many such ideas throughout the game, For example, as you approach the boss room in a dungeon, you can hear the boss's roars through the walls, adding tension, immersion, and signaling to the player that they're about to enter the boss room. This can be useful for deciding when to use potions, for example. There's also the entrance to the first dungeons, marked by a monster's mouth, indicating to the player that they are entering a more dangerous area. The cryptic hints provided to players for guidance without directly telling them also add to the overall mysterious atmosphere and player satisfaction. However, these riddles also contribute to the game's pervasive mysterious atmosphere, with mystery scattered throughout, objects whose purpose isn't immediately clear, and all of this is wonderfully underscored by the music. As requested by Miyamoto, the music sounds mysterious and epic in the overworld, mysterious and oppressive in the dungeons, and very foreboding as you enter the final dungeon. It's understandable why the game's music receives so much attention in reviews by journalists, as it plays a crucial role and is very different from what players were accustomed to hearing on the NES. In addition to the music, there are various sound effects that provide feedback on the in-game actions, like the sound of swinging your sword, hitting an enemy, exploding a bomb, burning something, using the magical wand, having low health, or blocking a projectile with your shield. While this may seem normal today, at the time it was extremely rare to have such a strong connection between sound and gameplay. This allowed players to quickly understand what was happening during the action. Finally, one last brilliant staging idea is the final boss, Ganon, who is invisible initially but becomes visible as a pile of dust after being defeated, revealing the Triforce of Power. Link and Zelda each brandish their respective Triforce, and you may have noticed that in this game there are only two Triforces: the Triforce of Wisdom, composed of the 8 fragments you collect, and the Triforce of Power, which Ganon possessed. The Triforce of Courage will only make its appearance in the next game in the series. And after defeating Ganon, freeing Zelda, and restoring peace to Hyrule, you unlock a second quest. The second quest presents a new adventure in a world similar but considerably more challenging, with entirely new gameplay mechanics. Firstly, all the secrets have changed their locations and are now better hidden than before, with even more secrets to discover. There's something to find on almost every screen in this second quest. Some NPCs will demand 20 rupees from you because you've destroyed the entrance to their hideout, making exploration more complicated and often leading to emotional ups and downs as everything is so well concealed, and there are very few hints in the second quest. This prompts players to start burning anything they see, planting bombs everywhere, or playing the flute everywhere because the flute can also open passages. When you do find something, sometimes it's just these cursed NPCs extorting you, although in most cases the discoveries are useful. The second quest is cleverly designed to constantly test your patience. For instance, when you retry secrets from the first quest, you might not find anything for a while, which might discourage you from continuing. But then lots of little things are hidden in the same places as in the first quest. For example, the entrance to the second dungeon is where the merchant who sells the blue ring used to be in the first quest. Yes, because the entrances to the dungeons have also been completely changed. Meanwhile, the enemies are now more numerous, have new patterns, and are more aggressive. The dungeons, too, have undergone significant changes in the second quest. They feature more enemies that are more aggressive and introduce gameplay mechanics that are much harder to grasp. For instance, in the second dungeon, you find yourself stuck between 2 rows of blocks, seemingly with no way to proceed. After moving around and checking the map, you realize that you need to descend and pass through the wall to continue. Such scenarios become quite common in the dungeons of the second quest. Sometimes you simply need to pass through the wall, and it may seem crazy to expect the player to do so without providing any clear indications. However, this unpredictability and the resulting player gratification amplify the emotions experienced during gameplay. Additionally, at the beginning, you cannot find any extra heart containers until you have access to bombs and the candle, which means you must complete the initial dungeons with the wooden sword. The layout of the dungeons has also changed. In the first quest, they represent different animals, while in the second quest, the final dungeon resembles Ganon's head. The first 5 dungeons in the second quest form the letters of the word Zelda, an interesting nod to the series. Curiously, you can initiate the second quest without even completing the first quest by naming your character Zelda. This is somewhat peculiar because Zelda is the name of the game, and some players might have assumed that the character's name is Zelda and inadvertently entered the second quest. Perhaps using a less common name could have prevented this confusion. But as with the first quest, some of the hints in the second quest were translated strangely. For example, in the first quest, an NPC advises us to go to the upper right of the map, which allows us to obtain the letter to give to an old lady who sells us potions afterward. In the Japanese version, this hint is entirely different, simply telling us that arrows cost rupees to use. There are a few other minor changes like this, but they do not significantly impact the gaming experience compared to the other changes. Another issue, especially for European players, is that the game runs in 50 Hz, since Europe used the PAL SECAM standard, which has a frame rate of 25 frames per second, unlike the NTSC standard used in Japan and North America, which runs at 60 Hz or 30 frames per second. This already makes the game a bit easier as it runs more slowly and slightly alters the gaming experience, unfortunately. However, they made an effort to speed up the game's music to match its original version and prevent it from being slowed down and inaudible, showing that they paid some attention to this aspect. The Legend of Zelda is a fabulous game that has the courage to emphasize adventure and prioritize immersion, even if it means excluding logical features like a map or a village. Through these choices, the game delivers a wide range of powerful emotions, just like in a real adventure, from unease and excitement to a bit of stress, loads of courage, and above all, a great deal of happiness. Exploration after exploration, battle after battle, discovery after discovery, all of this in a time when the video game industry was still in its infancy. It's an extraordinary game that was quickly recognized as such by both journalists and players. To illustrate just how remarkable this game was for its time, despite its incredible success, no one managed to create something similar for years. The original Legend of Zelda was released in 1986, and even though a few rare games like Rygar had some similarities, it wasn't until 1990 and 1991 that we began to see games that adopted its formula. Crystallis, developed by SNK, was one of the early attempts. However, it took until 1991 for Golden Axe Warrior from Sega to follow Zelda's formula almost identically. Unfortunately for them, by the time they caught up to Zelda's level, Nintendo had released the incredible A Link to the Past in the same year, but we'll discuss that a bit later. But The Legend of Zelda didn't stop at NES. It has been re-released on numerous occasions. It made its way to the Game Boy Advance and the Classic Collection, was available on Wii, 3DS, and Wii U through the Virtual Console, and even found its way to the GameCube in a collector's edition with Wind Waker. It was also released in the form of a Game & Watch, and there are even a third and fourth quest beyond the second one through the Super NES Satellaview, a rather peculiar accessory we'll talk about later. With each re-release, The Legend of Zelda continued to receive excellent reviews and enthusiastic reactions from players. It's an outstanding game that, while inspiring thousands of other games and even revolutionizing and popularizing a whole new genre of games, remains utterly unique. Subsequent games incorporated changes to make them more accessible. For instance, the introduction of cracked walls removes some of the surprise, as players know there's something behind them. While these changes aren't uninteresting, they leave out a part of the game that contributed to enhancing certain emotions that more recent games can no longer evoke. This makes the original The Legend of Zelda on the NES a game that offers a unique experience. Where The Legend of Zelda shines even more is in its exceptional balance. It is incredibly free and open, yet it provides minimal guidance through its level design. It's packed with secrets but offers hints. It acts as if the player doesn't exist while secretly aiding them. It constantly encourages players to search deeper and push their limits. Its impact on the industry is enormous. It demonstrated that RPGs could work well on consoles at a time when they struggled on microcomputers. It introduced the mainstream audience to this genre of games, benefiting series like Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy. Even these series struggled immensely to gain popularity outside of Japan, something The Legend of Zelda achieved right from the first game thanks to a universal formula. The Legend of Zelda set a new standard in the industry, a standard built on such solid foundations that games still released today use what Zelda introduced as their basis. And it's not just RPGs or action RPGs. Even games like the open-world design of the early GTA titles and the combat system in Dark Souls have characteristics that can be traced back to the Legend of Zelda. Not to mention more closely related games such as the Elder Scrolls series, for example. Furthermore, the Zelda series has evolved over time, but the first Zelda game laid the foundation and introduced a whole new vision that was rejuvenated with Breath of the Wild. This modern vision of an open world had already been set in place by Nintendo in 1986, when players were accustomed to chasing high scores in games. Zelda brought forth a genuine adventure that had nothing to do with current trends. It forever changed the history of video games, marking the beginning of a legendary saga that has captured the imaginations of millions of players worldwide. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like and subscribe, as it's essential for the channel. I had an incredible pleasure revisiting one of the most remarkable games in history, considering the context of its release and the incredible legacy it left on the world of video games. I'll see you soon for a new video. Take care.